Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for another breakfast chat. I think we should continue with this volume and hypertrophy discussion. It has been reasonably popular, and I've had a lot of people ask questions. So, one of the things that has come up from people is like, look, Jason, we know that you're saying that you can get plenty of hypertrophy by doing less sets by simply bringing up the intensity. And the intensity, we're not using the bodybuilder term, we are using the exercise science term for intensity, and that is percentage of your 1 rep max. So by bringing it up, so if we're doing sets of 10 with 60% of our max, which again is about a 15 to 16 rep max, versus 70% of your max, which is about 11 to 12 rep max, at 3 sets of 10, will produce a lot more hypertrophy very quickly with fewer sets. Because again, if you're doing the sets of 10 at 60%, you might need to do 10 total sets, right, before you start getting sets to failure. Whereas in at 70%, if it's a true 70%, you might start hitting failure on the third set, right? You're leaving a rep to 2 in the tank on the first set, but fatigue accumulates. And people will say, but if the fatigue is accumulating and you're hitting failure, then muscle failure is muscle failure. And doesn't that have a hypertrophic response? Yes, up to a point. The problem is that you're doing low quality work to get there. And here is where we run into the big problem when we look at the experimental data that we have, right? Things that have been tested and hypertrophy has been measured. The same circle of people who are promoting the higher volume have done other research, and well, specifically Dr. Brad. Look at some of Schoenfeld's other work. Remember, he did this whole study to where he's like, aha, see, we're showing, and other studies have shown the same thing, that short rest times do not equal more hypertrophy. The problem is that if his data from that is correct and conclusions are correct, it also knocks down the very high volume with a lower intensity to get there. It knocks it down because in the data that he had, they had studies where they had someone start with something, I believe it was like an 8 rep max. I could be wrong. Like an 8 rep max. And if they took long enough breaks to replicate that 8 rep set over 3 or 4 sets, they gained a certain amount of hypertrophy. But if they cut the rest times so that they had a challenging set of 8 with 100 kilos, right? 100 kilos on the first set, but if they only took 60 seconds, they couldn't replicate it for set 2, right? So they had to drop to 90 kilos to get 8 reps. And then if they only took another minute, they had to drop to like 80 kilos to get another 8 reps. Now, because we are reaching failure, or within 1 rep of it, but in this case, even if they took them to failure, they have to reduce the weight because you can't do the same reps. You're very quickly, by the third set, you're doing like 3 reps before you hit failure. So they found they had to drop the weight, but they could still reach failure. Now people would say, well, if the failure's still reached, then the mechanical tension doesn't matter. But in this case, they didn't find that to be true. They found that the lifters who took the longer breaks so that they could replicate their performance gained more muscle. Shorter breaks also reduces performance between sets. And of course they pointed out, oh, it's because more total volume was done. Well, only if we count volume as tonnage. Okay, the reps and the sets were the same. What's the only variable that changed to create that tonnage? The amount of weight on the bar, the mechanical tension. So therefore, we know based upon those studies, because again, you can call it, well, the tonnage done, the work done was higher, so therefore they grew more. Except again, the only part of the work that increased was the weight on the bar on the remaining sets after the first one. Okay, the mechanical tension was a factor. Just accumulating fatigue to where you were reaching failure didn't elicit maximum growth. It produced good muscle growth, but it didn't produce as much as the people with the longer breaks who lifted heavier weight. Mechanical tension mattered. Mechanical tension mattered for hypertrophy in this context. So The problem is that extrapolate that same data and conclusions over to doing, say, 10 sets of 10 with 10% less weight. You see where we're going with this? Think that through. You're trying to just get the volume without the tension. And yes, the final set or two might be to failure when you get there. But we know from the previous research that if you're hitting failure due to fatigue, accumulating fatigue with a lighter weight for the same number of reps, or you're losing a large number of reps, the hypertrophic response is reduced. It's less, you gain less muscle. So in theory, you could say, well, we're still hitting failure with the 10 sets of 10 versus the 3 sets of 10. But if we were to carry it back over to that other data, what happens? Well, you're still probably going to gain less muscle, and you're going to have done 10 sets to get there instead of 3. It's less muscle growth. And then come over and look at the women's German volume training studies. The really high volumes didn't produce superior muscle growth. And in fact, for some muscles and some lifters, maximum growth was achieved with as little as 5 sets for a muscle group. 5 sets in a muscle group. And we didn't see any growth beyond 10 sets in a training session. And keeping in mind, this isn't saying they weren't doing 5 or 10 sets or 20 sets of one exercise. It was multiple exercises, which you should be doing. So I'm not telling people, oh, you need to come in and just do 3 sets and that's all you do. No, you need to do more than one exercise. But even then, if you're doing 2, you're doing 6 sets, you're back over to that optimal training volume. You're back into that range at least. So the problem with just doing the endless sets is that not only are you spending 3 times as much time, because again, 10 sets done versus 3 sets, the quality of the sets is lower. The mechanical tension matters. When you look closely at the research, the tension matters. And even when you do see from these really high rep studies, when you do see hypertrophy, those have to be taken to failure. Every set has to. So when people are like, oh yeah, well 20 rep sets, 25 rep sets, whatever can build muscle, they can. If we look at the data and assume it's all correct, but they have to be limit sets. And even then, the same rules apply. If you're having to reduce the weight between sets to get the same performance, hypertrophy drops down. And I think it's fair to say that the same would be true, that if you just start with a lighter weight and do more sets, again, especially sets not to failure, all those early sets are just junk volume, and potentially the final sets may, if we extrapolate the data we have, may produce less muscle growth unless you up the dose, bro, in which case all bets are off. You just keep upping the dose, then yeah, in theory, that lower quality training and just the pump will continue to get you bigger and bigger. But it's not due to the training purely, it's largely due to the larger anabolic signaling from the gear, and in which case any training stimulus gets amplified. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.